on the NewsChannel 5 network. This is OpenLine.
Hello everyone, welcome to OpenLine. I am Ben Hall. A good show tonight. It's different, and I'm very excited about it. We're talking about Mars. The race to colonize Mars is on. That's right. The race to have people land on and live on Mars is obviously well underway, but there are ethical questions about what we should do there. Should we be there? How do we go about being there? And there's a book that's been written by a Vanderbilt professor, Life on Mars, What to Know Before We Go. And we're going to talk with the author of that book. Happy to have with us Professor David Weintraub. Thank you for being here.
Very glad to be here.
Vanderbilt astronomy professor. So let's start with Mars 101, first of all. Why do you think we are so fascinated with Mars?
I think the main reason we're so fascinated with Mars is because Mars is so much like the Earth. Once astronomers had invented the telescope and started pointing it at the sky, Mars was a fascinating object to look at. It was big. You could imagine that you were seeing parts of the surface. One of the first things astronomers discovered 350 years ago is that Mars rotates in 24 hours. The Earth rotates in 24 hours. It's like the Earth. Then they discovered Mars has polar caps. The Earth has polar caps. Then they discovered Mars's rotation axis is tilted a little bit relative to the direction of the sun. That's what gives the Earth seasons, which means Mars has seasons, and Mars has polar caps, and Mars has a 24-hour day. And by the beginning of the 19th century, astronomers had pretty much decided that Mars was like the Earth, and they started looking for the forests and the rivers and the oceans and the continents, and they found them. They were wrong. Mars didn't have oceans or rivers or continents, but they thought they saw them,
right,
which led astronomers even further down this rabbit hole of imagining that Mars is like the Earth. And we're still imagining that, even though we now know Mars is very much a desert. It doesn't have much of an atmosphere. In a lot of ways, it's very different from the Earth, but nevertheless, it holds our fascination as being an Earth-like planet.
When you tell me it has polar caps, then immediately I think, okay, well, is there life? Is there life within, there's ice, right?
There's
We're
ice.
talking about ice on the top and bottom, just like we have here. So is there life there?
Not that we know of yet, but we haven't ruled it out. The jury is still out on understanding whether Mars does or does not have life. A lot of attempts to measure or discover the presence of life have been made over the last 100 years. A number of those discoveries have shown up on page 1 of the New York Times saying, life discovered on Mars. A few years later, that discovery would be debunked.
Right.
But not all of the possible discoveries have been debunked. There's still a small chance, but a real chance, that Mars has life.
And when we're talking about life, obviously for many years it was Martians and full-blown life. And when we're talking about life, what we could be talking about, if it is there, would be the smallest forms of life.
We're talking about microbes now. We're talking about microbes that live beneath the surface. We know from the cameras that were on the Viking landers that set foot on Mars, if you will, landed on Mars in 1976. Those cameras looked at Mars. They didn't see any creatures wandering around on the surface. We have mapped the surface of Mars with orbiting cameras very, very carefully. There are no cities, there are no forests, there are no trees, there are no rabbits. There's nothing to see on the surface. And the surface is an incredibly harsh environment. Radiation from space penetrates the atmosphere. We have an ozone layer to protect us from ultraviolet light from the sun. Mars has no ozone layer. The ultraviolet light gets to the surface. If you were on the surface at the moment without additional protection, you could not survive. X-rays from space penetrate the atmosphere to the surface. A lot of X-rays, they're not good for you either. What are called cosmic rays from space, which are high-energy particles, penetrate the atmosphere. They're bad for you. They'd be bad for anything on the surface of Mars. So if anything exists on Mars, it's microscopic life under the surface.
And we could learn a lot from that. That would still be an incredibly important discovery, and there would be a great deal to learn from whatever might be alive there, right?
Indeed. The discovery of life on Mars, again, there may not be any life on Mars,
right,
but we don't know. Let's imagine that we do discover there's life on Mars. There are two possibilities. The first possibility is those microbes have DNA. If those microbes have DNA, the chances that life developed independently on Mars and Earth, and independently developed DNA-based life, I think that's zero. If it's DNA-based life, then life got started on Mars, and an asteroid hit Mars and knocked a rock off to the Earth, and we're descended from Martians. We are Martians. Okay? The alternative is life got started on Earth and got kicked to Mars, and they're Earthlings. It's much easier to get a rock from Mars to Earth than to get one from Earth to Mars. So if it's DNA-based life, we're almost certainly descended from Martians. That would be incredibly profound knowledge to have. The second possibility, if there is life, is that it's not DNA-based. It's life that's completely independent of life on Earth, which would mean life got started on two planets that are right next to each other, orbiting the same star. For life to get started on two different planets independently would tell us that life is almost easy. Right. Life throughout the universe, life on planets in the Milky Way galaxy probably is abundant. Mars is the closest place in the universe where we can test the question, is there life somewhere else in the universe? And how easy is it for life to actually come into existence?
See, as you talk about this, that's so exciting. That is so interesting, and I want to know, but I guess we don't have that answer right now. There is a lot of talk about going to Mars. So how long would it take us to go to Mars? How close are we to actually going to Mars?
Closer than most of us realize. Within the decade, we could have people setting foot on Mars. The group that's closest to getting to Mars in terms of technology is Elon Musk's SpaceX Corporation. And many of your viewers, I'm sure, have seen the launches of the SpaceX rockets, and he's making bigger and bigger rockets. Every goal that Elon Musk has set for SpaceX for space launches, he's met. And the next goal is in 2020 to have the first launch of the rocket that's currently called the BFR. The big rocket. We'll just leave it as the big rocket. Okay. And the BFR is the launch vehicle that's supposed to be able to take astronauts to Mars. I see no reason to not expect him to succeed in the first launch of the BFR in 2020, since he keeps meeting his goals. And he claims his goal in 2022 is to start sending payloads to Mars, unmanned payloads to Mars, and in 2024 to send astronauts to Mars. Given his track record of success with SpaceX, I don't think we should doubt his ability to do it. That's not the same as doubting whether it's a good idea or not, but he may in fact have the ability to get there. NASA wants to go to Mars, but NASA is not as far along. NASA also has a different consideration they have to work with that SpaceX doesn't, and that is SpaceX will have the ability, probably by the mid-2020s, to get astronauts to Mars. They will not have the ability to bring those astronauts home. Maybe they will develop the ability to do that in the near or distant future. They will have to take a rocket to Mars, land it on the surface that's capable of launching off of Mars, but they also have to have fuel for the rocket. And we can't take the fuel with us. You have to manufacture the fuel there. And no one knows how to do that yet. So at the moment, the astronauts going to Mars will be going on a one-way trip, landing on the surface of a planet that's an incredibly hostile environment. They can't go outside and breathe the oxygen. There's no oxygen to breathe. They can't live on the surface. They will either have to have shelters that protect them from the radiation, or they'll have to live underground. Maybe they will survive. Maybe they won't. It's extreme to call it a suicide mission because it's possible they could live. But it's also probable that they won't survive very long. They need food. They can't take all the food with them. We can keep launching rockets with supplies, but what if the rocket doesn't make it? They need to be able to grow their food on Mars. They need to be able to find water on Mars. There are ice caps. There's water in the permafrost underground, but they have to get to the water, retrieve the water, figure out how to cycle the water and take care of the water. There's a lot of things they have to do to survive.
And it's interesting this is being done by a private entity.
Right.
And I feel like a lot of people don't know that we're that close to going to Mars, and maybe that's because it's more private and it's not NASA that we all follow. And
maybe. Elon Musk has spoken about this at length in a lot of public forums, but they're big rocket meetings or technology meetings. They're not things that typically get reported as widely as certain other things might. NASA wants to go to Mars, but because NASA is using your tax dollars, NASA needs to be able to bring the astronauts home. So NASA right now is talking about sending astronauts, humans, to the Mars system in the 2030s. By that, they seem to be planning to send astronauts into orbit around Mars, and then they can bring them home, but not land them on the surface. We could reasonably imagine in 20 years NASA will have the ability to get a rocket with astronauts, with all the life support systems, to Mars, into orbit, and bring the rocket home. That's a very different enterprise than landing on the surface and getting back off the surface.
With current technology, how long would it take? Would it be, like, how long is the journey?
The journey is about 6 months. There's a good launch window to Mars about every 2 years, which is why there are launches in 2018 and 2020 and 2022 and 2024, just because of the relative positions of the Earth and Mars in their orbits around the Sun. So every 2 years, we have a good launch window to go to Mars. And that launch window is open for a few months. And then it takes about 6 months to get rockets with current rocket speeds to Mars.
Wow.
Presumably it would take about the same length of time to get home. So a round trip is probably a year minimum.
Wow. So that's significant.
That's significant. You've got to keep those astronauts alive in the spacecraft. You've got to protect them from radiation from space in the spacecraft. We can do that on the space station. Astronauts have lived in the space station for a year at a time. But the space station is a bigger, more protected environment than a rocket on its way to Mars would be. And if the sun has a giant solar flare, we've got to be able to protect those astronauts in that little spacecraft going to Mars. I'm not convinced we know how to do that yet, but there are engineers working hard on solving that problem.
All right, so I want to dive down into all of this. We kind of set the table, but before we go to break, you have written a book. We're close enough to going to Mars that you've written a book, What to Know Before We Go. And the book really focuses on some of the ethical questions, right, about going to Mars.
I would say the bookends, the first chapter and the last chapter, focus on those ethical questions. What's in between sets up why those questions are worth asking. What's in between is an examination of the various experiments that have looked for life on Mars and what they've found, and why some of those experiments definitively found nothing, or why some of those experiments are hard to interpret and might in fact indicate the presence of life. All of that information sets up the ethical questions: should we be doing this, or maybe we shouldn't.
And you were talking as you came up here, the LA Times, I guess, is talking. This book, a lot of people want to talk to you about it.
They seem to.
Because I think it's fascinating, and it's different than all the other stuff we're hearing about now. I mean, there's some hopeful, good stuff in there. It's interesting stuff.
Mars is a fascinating place, and again, in the lifetimes of our children and grandchildren, whether there is or is not life on Mars, I think it's likely humans will be on Mars in the near term.
In the lifetime of our children, you think humans will be on Mars?
By the end of the 21st century, I think it's very, very likely. However we resolve the question of is there life on Mars and should we or should we not go, I think there will be people on Mars.
Because, and then I'm going to go to break, but because Mars is not going to be like the moon. The moon, we sent someone up, they walked around, they came back. You go to Mars, you feel like we're going to stay there.
I think we'll stay there.
We're going to colonize Mars. Well, that's very interesting. All right, we're going to take a break. If you want to join in, there's the number, 615-737-PLUS, 615-737-7587. Take a break. Be back right after this.